Welcome back to the Download Show. Today, we're diving into one of the most urgent and fascinating questions of our time. How is AI reshaping education? And to help us unpack this, I'm honored to be joined by Lee Rainie, longtime director at the Pew Research Center and running a research center now at Elon University. One of the most respected voices on how emerging technologies are shaping public life. Lee has spent years tracking how Americans think about the internet, AI, and the future of learning. And today we'll talk about what it really means to be educated in the age of AI, whether our institutions are adapting fast enough, and what role teachers and universities will play in this transformation. Whether you're an educator, a student, or just trying to stay ahead of the curve, this conversation is for you. Thank you, Lee, for joining our show.
It's wonderful to be with you.
So first question, I really want to ask you, and let's go really kind of granular. Uh, How do you think the current education system, and do you think it is adapting fast enough to the rise of generative AI tools like ChatGPT, Perplexity, and the like?
There's a pervasive urgency and almost panic throughout the educational establishment, sort of early school through middle school and high school, and then at the level of higher education. So there's a deep sense that things have to change and things are being deeply disrupted, but there are lots of arguments about which direction to go. So big things are on the table, and there is a concerted effort up and down the stack to think about what it means to be competent and learned and prepared to be a good citizen and a good worker in the future. That's all on the table now. But how to do that and how to retain some of the best of the traditional elements of education while embracing some of the new stuff is the question on the table. And there's just in America, and my sense is around the world, the spectrum of reaction runs the full gamut from high level panic and resistance to high level embrace. And so there's not in campus by campus, discipline by discipline, grade level by grade level, region by region, there are raging debates about how to do this and nothing resembling consensus about how to do it well.
Mm. What and kind of taking kind of a stab in that as well. The institutions, or let's say the geographies or the institutions that are doing it well, what are they doing especially well? Are they having the right debates? Are they at least asking the questions? And conversely, the ones that are not dealing with it well, what aren't they doing well?
We did a survey actually of college and university leaders, presidents, provosts, chancellors, high ranking deans, and there's a wide distribution even there. The places that feel the best about what they're doing are encouraging experimentation, encouraging co-learning, both students and faculty sort of in the same mix, trying to help each other through things. There's no sense that there's a top-down solution here. Yeah, there's a hunger for new rules and regulations about how to embrace this in your classroom or not, how to grade or not, how to measure competency or not, how to reward students for their mastery and credential in the right way for that. So there's a sense that the places that are at least not resistant, that are now encouraging students to use the tools, encouraging faculty to use the tools, and report out to the broader community of the educated what's working and what's not. And there's a sense that it's a great big experiment. We've got this gigantic natural experiment about how people embrace change in the world. And so places that are feeling good about it are all in and encouraging people to do experiment and report out what the results are. There are incredible debates that are completely unresolved about accreditation. How do you measure competency? What does literacy look like in these areas? What does a well-educated person look like? And it's not necessarily the big shift, of course, is that education used to be measured by what you learned and how you reported it back to yourself and the wider culture. Now there's a sense that learning is a process and it's an ongoing process, and knowing how to access information rather than mastering information itself. So it's a connective process rather than a process of just understanding the material. And there are, the companies are encouraging this. So one of the other debates that's just coincident with this is how do we, in the education community, work with commercial enterprises in such a big disruption. So there are ethical issues, there are related issues about the use of resources for language models and whether that's an appropriate thing to tap into when you're teaching. And so again, sort of there are just raging debates up and down the stack.
Um, so you talked a little bit about actually the process and how, that it's if I can summarize it this way, it seems less about like the content consumption, but really the process and the transformation of the student when it comes to, let's just say, the college education kind of experience. So less about that consumption of content, more about the transformative experience. Do you see kind of all these changes also kind of impacting the college? How do you say the institution marketplace as well? Just because I mean, we've got a lot of institutions in the United States. It's wildly expensive now. I'm sure some students are kind of saying, well, this product is clearly a great transformative experience for me. This one isn't as much. This one is more content. And I can, the trade-off is I can actually get that content, online and through AI. So are you seeing also some of that making an impact on institutions and maybe consolidation or going out of business, for example?
This is a trend that fits into a couple of other mega trends that are also affecting college life. So this is the biggest one. I mean, it literally calls into question almost every element of what education stands for and how it should be conducted. But in America in particular, the other forces at work are the rising expenses of college, and the very related question is the investment worth it? What kind of return on investment can you expect on college? So there are lots of studies showing college education stands you in good stead as a longtime earner and just as a actor in your country and in your community and things. But still, it's an on the question. It's on the table now in ways it didn't used to be. There's a cultural dimension to it where conservatives in the United States are now thinking that universities are sort of centers of sort of leftist cultural output, and there's that concern that relates to it. And then there's sort of a demographic story that's the a big reality staring at colleges now, which is people stopped having babies in America, or there are many fewer babies, particularly starting with the Great Recession, 2008-9. But even before then, birth rates were falling, and so there are literally fewer and fewer emergent 18-year-olds coming into the marketplace. And so, yes, consolidation is already taking place. Yes, there are places that are just closing their doors because they can't, meet payroll and pay their bills and things like that. And so the level of disruption at the college level is enormously high. The other mega trend that is certainly enabled by or encouraged by the rise of language models and other AI systems is spreading out education. It's not necessarily a 4-year, 5-year, 6-year thing where you get your undergraduate degree and then you're off to the world and you don't have to think about education anymore. One of the big changes that we saw in the Great Recession and now really carries through to this era is the sense that you have to be a lifelong learner, that you have to do a deep, brutal evaluation of your own skills and talents pretty regularly now, and to figure out what gaps you need to fill and figure out what technologies are heading down the pike that you're going to have to master and what they mean for yourself, for your business, and for the industry that you're in. There are some industries that are so deeply disrupted by this that the mix of talents you need to succeed is changing in real time.
Hmm. What is you're shifting away a little bit from actually the role of administrators and the institution stuff. How about the role of teachers? I mean, a lot of these teachers didn't come in with AI, so they're learning as quickly as the students even. How are the teachers kind of thinking about this? How are they trying to adapt? And what is their role going to be in the future? I mean, it's not a strictly kind of traditional teacher student type of relationship, right? I guess to some degree, it'd be some sort of I don't know what the right word is, but some sort of co-facilitator, if you will.
Yeah, really smart question. And it varies by discipline and by classroom, but the sense is that literally what happens in the classroom is now different from what it used to be. I mean, there were things that were happening in the internet era, pre AI becoming a big popular consumer technology, where transmission of information, the sage on the stage model of education, was giving way to something that was more egalitarian, something that was more, there's this idea of the flipped classroom, which is not a new idea here, but the basic sense that the old model of a teacher teaching students and the teacher and the students doing homework at home and then coming back and to get tested on it and things like that. The flipped version of that is that in some classrooms now in the United States, the expectation is that the student mastery of material or the student exposure to material takes place in homework. And that when you're in the classroom, you're working with your teacher, you're working with your peers to question the material or fill in spots where you don't feel like you've mastered the material, and so the homework side of things gets done in the classroom, and the teaching side of things gets done outside the classroom. That's really happening now. But the big stressor for many teachers is literally how do I adjust my curriculum, my syllabus to these new realities. I mean, I can assign reading. Assigning papers is to show whether students have mastered a subject or not is really deeply called into question because there's a widespread belief that lots of students are cheating. They're just feeding the assignment into a language model and cutting and pasting the answer and handing it in. And there's also a coincident sense that the teachers and the tools, the tech tools to identify AI generated stuff are not that good. They give you a lot of false positives. They give you a lot of positive negatives, and so there's this widespread sense that the old model, of course, doesn't work. And then of course there's a new set of tools that are really interesting. I mean, any number of professors, actually large numbers, are, for instance, turning their syllabuses into language models. You can query a language model that's listed on the professor's website and ask about what about this assignment or what are supplementary materials that I can get on this website or where did this come from in the first place. There are professors who are just creating these sort of brilliant historical and relevant activities for their classrooms. So there are Shakespeare bots. There are Abraham Lincoln bots. There are bots related to how companies, I mean, case study kinds of things about how companies have solved problems and things like that. So there are lots of ways that these are adding creative tools to the toolkit, but professors, in many cases, particularly sort of junior level and rising people in the academy, they've got a lot of work to do already. And then reinventing what you're doing in the classroom, reinventing your testing methods, reinventing how your grading protocols is just on the table, and they're feeling particularly stressed out by the level of disruption and change that they have to make in the stuff that used to work for them just a couple of years ago.
So it sounds like actually on that front as well that there's going to be huge changes. Going back to kind of thinking about, so we've talked about the institution changing or changing an institution. I think the student expectations, the teacher expectations. What do you think would what does it mean to be educated in let's say in the future? Um, and I've got actually kind of thesis that actually more and more education would probably kind of skew towards the lower grades, and maybe the higher grades would be, I don't know, more focused on adapting to the real world to some degree. But what do you think? I mean, how what would constitute education, and let's just say specifically college education, um, in the future? I
There's
mean, is
a
this still a college degree, if you will? I mean, would employers even look at that and say that's worth anything?
That's a question on the table, and there are some people who are even in higher education who are saying that might not be the way of the future. But for now, mostly still getting agree matters. It's a marker of a stage of life and what you've mastered over the course of years, just the way, passage from fifth grade to sixth grade is a passage that has to be marked and noted and measured for educational purposes. But there's a really interesting sort of emergent consensus. I wouldn't call it widespread yet, but that um, in this environment where you can get the answers you might need on lots of questions just by consulting language models and typing your smart prompts into them and pressing them for smart answers on this, there are things that computers now can do better than humans. There's a strong sense, and there's documented sense, that these tools have more intelligence in some respects than humans do. So the call to humans and the call to educators in this era is to cultivate the skills that are particularly human in here and mastering them. Because the jobs of the future, the technical parts of them, the repetitive and even sort of drudgery parts of those jobs will often be done by computers. So what are humans going to be doing to get paid for contributing to their workplaces? And it's going to be what used to be called soft skills.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
The
that
humanities, the liberal
the
arts.
humanities, liberal arts, but sort of empathy, social and emotional intelligence, complex problem solving, decision making, and things like that. But even in those areas, there are ways now that the AI systems that are commonplace look pretty good at least faking it for empathy and bringing social and emotional intelligence to some kinds of problems. Still kind of a mess and still not mastered the subject, but the companies that are building them and the call for artificial general intelligence includes that bucket of things. So even those soft skills are on the table, but the mark of an educated person is going to be kind of at least fluency and literacy in AI and all the related systems, like how do you assess information? How do you add your own smartness to information that's being generated? And it's also sort of teamwork, how to work in teams and how to iterate a lot and how to do what, the social scientists or, cognitive scientists call metacognition, testing yourself, knowing where your blind spots are, knowing where you haven't really consulted all the relevant kinds of information you need to have, and inviting in and making sure that your network, the people that you work with, will call you on that, and that you are called to be sort of a critic of your colleagues and a feedback architect and a sort of red team tester of information and things like that. So there are ways in which basic behavior with other human beings is, if you do it well, it's the mark of intelligence and education. And if you do it badly, you're not too terribly well educated and smart.
Sounds like we're going back to the classic days of the classics of Aristotle, Socrates, of humanities. Wouldn't you?
I think that's where you get to. I mean, so much of the American debate in colleges revolves around the relevance of humanities in a technical world where so many jobs are oriented towards the technical stuff. What good are humanities? And I think these tools now sort of raise the possibility that the relevance of humanities is very much front and center. How do we act well as humans? And at the end of the day, when um, jobs are in flux and there's so much transition in the thick of people's lives, sort of figuring out who you are and figuring out how to make meaning out of your life and figuring out how to make purpose in your life. This is the call of these kinds of technologies. It's not only how do you get paid for doing stuff and how do you sort of make your way in a world where this is now ubiquitous, but it's how do you perform good human chores? How do you act well in a community? How do you serve other people well? How do you make your contribution to your community and things like that?
Now, let's talk about kind of the practical side of it. You did say, I mean, this seems like one, a very complex problem. Two, there's no consensus yet on kind of, what is the best practice. But how quickly or how long do you think kind of these changes, will get spread out or will get spread through? And are there any kind of geographies that you've seen that maybe will adapt AI faster in terms of college education than other places?
Yes, there'll definitely be a sort of wide distribution of adoption, and mastery of these kinds of things. I think you made a really smart point at the very top of the show where you were talking about the the challenges and the way institutions sort of struggle to keep up with the obvious things that are changing in culture. I mean, that's by definition, clusters of people don't do as well mastering things as individuals. Individuals can move fast, but we need institutions to go far. You know, that's the old cliche of it. And there are just processes in education that need to be worked through and need to be consensus building processes. You can't sort of make up your own rules about what mastery looks like. If you're at an institution, you have to sort of sync yourself up with other disciplines and other folks who are at different levels of mastery and enthusiasm for these products. So there's a way in which there will be differences by classroom by classroom, but there's a sense that moving towards new definitions of mastery, new definitions of what credentials look like in an environment where the skill set you need to perform well in the culture, particularly perform well at jobs, is up for grabs. So a couple of things are really interesting that are happening in classrooms. First, co-learning is taking place. I mean, there are professors now at my school and others that are basically saying to the students, one of the elements of your grade is going to be whether you teach me something about these tools, what they can do, how they can serve you, what is smart prompting strategies. And if you teach me something new, your grade's going to be better. So the incentive structure is sort of orienting around that. There are other professors, as I've mentioned, who are using these tools in their pedagogy, in their classroom, to provide new enriching experiences for people who want to know what it was like to be in the Civil War and want to know what Aristotle thought and want to know how things look in the corporate boardroom when decision making is being done. There are other ways in which professors are basically saying to the students, "I'm at a loss here. You've got to help me get through." And there are ways in which the knowing that the environment of the future is going to be built around teamwork and feedback and stuff, they're building sort of structures of assignments around student feedback. So you go off with a cluster of students, you complete a project, you present it to the class, sort of Shark Tank like, and
Mm.
then you get pulled apart by your peers in the classroom. And the grades are allocated by how smart was the presentation in the first place, how smart is the feedback you're getting from your peers in the classroom. So it's not just you and your assignment, you're getting graded on that. How well you received the criticism, how well you adjusted to the criticism, and things like that. So there's a sense that people operating in concert or people operating in communities are a new measure of whether people are going to succeed in the future or not. And then there's just now a very wide embrace of the idea that in addition to grades, which are never not going to be a part of education, portfolios are a new measure of how students are doing things, in part because if you take a body of work and use it as a credential for your job, you're standing yourself in good stead, not only writing a good cover letter and having a decent resume as part of that package, but walking in the door with a story to tell about how your mind works is the new way to sort of encounter employers and anybody who wants to test whether you got a good college education or not. So there's a sense that all kinds of traditional kinds of education activities are having to adjust to the realities of cheating that's possible in this, but also the realities that human activity is being changed by this.
Very interesting. Actually, let me end on this question. So I have a thesis that so ultimately, though, the employers are the ones that hiring, and if let's say the employers are still conservative, there's still kind of that blockage, if you will, right? I guess they don't need to adapt as quickly as they've got a bunch of people applying for, let's say, for example, McKinsey, Barron Point or Booz Allen. They've got a bunch of kind of smart people. They don't need to change kind of their criteria necessarily, or are they adapting as well? Because I guess from a job perspective, they're also looking for people that can work with AI.
That's the point, is that measuring somebody's competency now includes how good they are at working with a language model and things like that. So there are ways that um, it's sort of the tests that you are given as a job applicant, often now, particularly at the big consultancies, include AI components to them. And there are ways that you have to demonstrate how to be a smart prompter and how to assess the quality and accuracy of the information that comes out of AIs. I mean, literacy now includes you have to check it for whether it's lying to you or hallucinating to you, I guess is a better thing to do. But those kinds of things are now front and center for consultancies, but across the board. And there are interesting ways now that there's an emerging documentation that at the level of the company, that it's sometimes the case, particularly at consultancies, that sort of middling performers, mediocre performers, are getting a big boost out of using AI. And the level of the improvement in their work is higher than the level of improvement of the work of the higher performers. Because high performers sort of do work well, and their level of growth doesn't necessarily show up as well as sort of middling performers. But there are ways in which now that you're constantly being tested about how you're doing things and your productivity and things like that. And so you have to sort of keep evaluating your skills and keep upping your game as you march into a business and then out of a business. The other thing that's of course happening is that AI is taking over what used to be entry level skills at all levels. So certainly at the professional level, you think of the work that young junior associates at law firms do, or at architecture firms, or in businesses. Those kinds of rote kinds of elements of work and those kinds of sort of preliminary responses to sort of simple questions, that stuff is now being done by AI. So there's now in this season, just in the hiring season right now going on in America, there's a sense that entry level jobs are evaporating, and that the thing that a lot of us have gotten in our entry level jobs is how to be in that job in the first place. It's one thing to learn in a classroom at a college what it's like. It's another thing to sort of sit in a cubicle and doing those things. And that mastery now, or that sort of extra increment of learning that's taking place of how you are in the workplace at the start of your career, there are fewer of those things now because AI is doing those kinds of jobs, and so we haven't obviously seen a generation where that's the reality of how you enter the marketplace. But you could imagine that sort of the expectation about your entry level skills is going to be higher than if AI can do it, you're not going to get hired. And so you're going to have to demonstrate that you're sort of a step or two above what used to be considered perfectly competent to do an entry level job at a place.
Absolutely fantastic conversation. Thank you very much for your time, Lee.
Been great to be with you, Tack. Thank you.